The letter was typed. That was the first thing I noticed, not handwritten, not personal, but typed and printed on plain paper, as though the ending of a family relationship required the formality of a memo. It was left on my bed on the morning of my 18th birthday, which I understood later was deliberate timing. 18 was the age at which the act became clean. No legal obligation remaining. No social question about parental duty. I was an adult, and adults could be released without ceremony. My name is Jonah. I am telling this story now from a position of enough distance that I can describe what happened without the particular tremor that used to accompany it in the years. Immediately after, the tremor is gone. What replaced it is something more structural, a settled understanding of what I am, what I built, and why the call that came 5 years later landed the way it did. The letter said that my choices had made it impossible for the family to continue as it was. It listed those choices in the language of moral certainty: the way I lived, the relationships I had pursued, the values I had expressed as I grew into myself through late adolescence. It said that my parents and my 2 older brothers had discussed the matter and had reached a collective decision. It said I was welcome to collect my belongings over the following week. It said they wished me well. It was signed by my father only, in the way that executive decisions in our family had always been signed by him, on behalf of everyone, as though the others were subsidiaries rather than people. I read it twice. I folded it. I put it in my jacket pocket and I walked to the kitchen where my mother was making breakfast. And I looked at her, and she looked at the counter. That was the conversation. In all the words that were not said in that kitchen, I understood everything I needed to understand about what the letter had cost her and what she had permitted anyway. I was out within 4 days. A university friend's floor, then a room in a shared house closer to the campus where I had deferred my enrollment but now called the financial aid office from a payphone and undeferred immediately, explaining the change in my circumstances in the clinical language that officers like that respond to. They were helpful. People in bureaucratic positions are often more genuinely helpful than people with blood obligation, which was a lesson I filed and kept. I worked 2 jobs in my first year. Not dramatically, I want to be clear about that, because the story of a young person working hard after family rejection can slide into a particular genre of suffering that this story is not. It was simply a logistical reality that I managed. Days were structured. Evenings were study. Weekends were shifts at a hotel front desk where I learned, faster than I might have otherwise, how to read people and manage situations and remain composed when the person in front of you is unreasonable and believes their unreasonableness is your problem to absorb. I studied architecture. I had chosen it before the letter, before the kitchen. Before any of this, I had chosen it because I was drawn to the idea of structures that hold things up, systems that bear weight without collapsing, the geometry of things that last. I understand now that I was drawn to it for reasons that had nothing to do with buildings and everything to do with what I had grown up inside. I wanted to understand how things were held together. I wanted to be someone who knew how to build rather than someone who simply inhabited what other people had constructed. I did not contact my family for 3 years. Not out of rage. I want to be precise about that because rage would imply an ongoing relationship with them, which is its own form of connection. I simply had nothing to say to them that would be useful, and they had given me no indication that they wished to hear it. I built the 3 years cleanly. Degree progression, work experience, a small professional reputation beginning to form in the way that reputations form through the accumulation of showing up, doing the work correctly, and being the person in the room that other people begin to rely on. In my 3rd year, I was introduced through a university professor to a senior architect at a mid-sized firm with a strong residential and heritage portfolio. She was the kind of professional who hired on the basis of demonstrated capacity, rather than credentialed connection. And she offered me a part-time placement that became full-time before graduation, and a formal position by the time I had my degree in hand. I did not celebrate graduation with family. I celebrated it with 3 friends and my supervisor at a restaurant she chose. And it was the first occasion in my adult life where being present felt entirely uncomplicated. By year 4, I was managing a project independently, a residential commission, a private client who had come through the firm's network, a renovation of a heritage property with structural complications that the senior partners did not have bandwidth for, and I did. I managed it from brief to completion without significant issue. The client referred 2 others within 6 months. I was 23 years old and I had, without planning for it explicitly, become someone who was useful in a very specific and documented way. The call came at the beginning of year 5. My father's number on my phone still saved, which surprised me when I saw it, because I had not consciously decided to keep it. It rang 4 times before I answered. I answered because I was curious in the detached way of someone examining something that no longer has the power to damage them. He said my name the way he always had, as a statement, not a greeting. Then he said, "We need to talk." I said, "All right." He said there was a situation. He used that word, situation. He said the family had encountered some difficulties and there were certain things that required resolution, and he had been advised that I might be in a position to assist. The situation, which I learned over the following 2 phone calls and a meeting I agreed to with conditions, was this. My grandfather had died 14 months earlier. I had not been informed. His estate, which was modest but real, centered on a property that had been in the family for 40 years, had entered probate. In the process of that probate, a complexity had emerged. My grandfather, who had been a deliberate man with his own private understanding of how things should go, had included in his will a clause that tied the property's distribution to the agreement of all biological grandchildren. There were 4 of us. 3 were involved in the family, as it currently stood. The 4th was me. Without my signature on the distribution agreement, the property could not be transferred. It would remain in probate, accruing costs, while the family's access to the asset they had expected was suspended indefinitely. My grandfather had not discussed this clause with anyone. My father believed, or said he believed, that it was a standard inclusion. My attorney, whom I retained before the 2nd phone call, believed it was deliberate. Knowing what I knew of my grandfather, a man who had always been quieter than the rest of them, and had always looked at me a little longer than necessary at family occasions, as though taking an inventory of what he saw, I believed it was deliberate too. I did not sign immediately. I retained my attorney and I asked her to walk me through every dimension of the situation, what my signature meant, what my refusal meant, what conditions could be attached to my agreement, and what the timeline and cost implications were for the estate if the matter remained unresolved. She was thorough. The picture that emerged was one in which I held, without having sought it, a significant lever. A lever that my grandfather had, with quiet precision, placed in my hand across the distance of 5 years, and his own death. My father wanted a meeting. I agreed to one, in a professional setting, a conference room at my attorney's office. Not a family home, not a restaurant he chose. My conditions for the meeting were communicated in advance through my attorney's office. He would attend without my brothers. The discussion would be documented. I would have my legal counsel present. He agreed to all of it, which told me more about the urgency of his need than any conversation had. I want to describe that meeting because it was unlike any interaction I had experienced with my father in 18 years of living under his roof. He was measured in the way of a man who had prepared himself, but underneath the preparation was something I had not seen from him before: contingency. He needed something. He had always been a person around whom need flowed in one direction only, and sitting across a conference table from the son he had dismissed with a typed letter, needing something from that son, had rearranged the geometry of the room in a way that neither of us could ignore. I let him speak. He outlined the situation, which I already understood fully. He suggested that the matter was straightforward, and that my signature was a formality. He said, and I found this particular word remarkable, that he hoped we could be adult about the situation. I said, I think being adult about it is exactly what I'm doing. He paused. I said I had reviewed the estate documents, and I had some questions about the process that my attorney would follow up on. I said I was not opposed in principle to participating in the distribution, but that I wanted the meeting to accomplish something broader than a signature on a property transfer. He asked what I meant. I said I wanted acknowledgement. Not an apology. I was precise about that distinction because I had thought about it carefully. Apologies are performances. What I wanted was acknowledgement of fact, that I had been removed from the family, that I had received no contact for 5 years, that I had built everything I had without support or assistance, and that I was now being approached because something was needed from me. I wanted those facts named out loud, in this room, in front of my attorney, in the documentation of this meeting. He was quiet for a long time. I watched him move through several responses internally before settling on one. He said, "What happened?" "Was handled badly." I said, "Say more than that." He said, "We handled it badly. The way it was done." "I understand that," I said. "And the 5 years?" He said, "And the 5 years. It was not a reckoning. It was not a scene. There was no embrace, no collapsed grief, no undoing of anything. It was simply a man saying into a documented record what was true, because he needed something that required him to be in the same room as that truth. I had not planned for it to be more than that. And it was not more than that, and that was enough." I signed the distribution agreement 3 weeks later, after my attorney confirmed every element of the document. I signed it because withholding my signature would have meant allowing a situation my grandfather had carefully constructed to become an ongoing legal and financial burden, and I did not want to carry that weight either. More importantly, I signed it because I had received what I came for, and I am not someone who requires ongoing punishment of people who have already demonstrated what they adopt my portion of the estate, which the clause also entitled me to, was transferred to my account 4 months after probate closed. It was not a large sum. It was not nothing. I used a portion of it to fund the early stages of establishing my own practice, which I had been considering for 2 years and had been building the conditions for, with the same patience I had brought to everything else in the preceding 5 years. My mother called me 2 weeks after the meeting. She did not reference the meeting or the estate or the letter on my bed on my 18th birthday. She asked how I was. I said I was well. She said she was glad. We spoke for 11 minutes about unremarkable things. Before she ended the call, she said, "I have thought about that morning many times." I said, "I know." She said nothing further. Neither did I. My brothers have not called. I hold no specific weight about that. People reveal what they are willing to risk for connection, and the silence of my brothers tells me what they are willing to risk, which is nothing, which is simply information. I have a practice now, small and specific, which is how I prefer it. Heritage restoration and adaptive reuse, old things brought forward. Structures that have stood through difficult conditions, given the careful attention required to let them stand through more. I chose the specialism deliberately. I am aware of why I chose it. My grandfather's property, which now belongs jointly to my brothers and my parents following the distribution I enabled, sits in a market that has increased significantly over the 5 years it took to reach resolution. Their share is worth considerably more than anyone anticipated when probate opened. My enabling of that outcome is not something any of them have formally acknowledged beyond the legal process. I did not expect them to. The letter is still folded in the same jacket pocket. Not the jacket, I no longer have the jacket. The letter itself in a small box on a shelf in my office. I keep it not as a wound, but as a document. The earliest piece of evidence in a case file that has since grown considerably, and whose final entry is not a confrontation or a collapse but a signed agreement on a conference room table, my name. At the bottom, my attorney beside me. My father across from me saying the words I needed him to say. That is what 5 years built. Not revenge, not triumph. Something quieter and more permanent. A position from which what had been done to me could be named, acknowledged, and filed, and then the door could close, not in anger but in completion.